In this episode,
I'm poking about in derelict buildings, pumping water from ancient sources, creeping around on old footpaths, keeping my nose firmly to the ground, calling out the emergency services, climbing on board a Pullman coach, scaling an old prison wall, and generally having a good poke about a rural Sussex town.
So sit back and enjoy another episode of The Bald Explorer.
My name is Richard Vobes, and in this series I'm exploring the history, myths and legends of Great Britain. Today I'm on my way to the rural town of Petworth in West Sussex. I know it's famed for its large Georgian house, but there is a lot more to see besides.
I haven't been to Petworth for many years. In fact, the last time I was in Petworth I was 18. I used to live around here, only for a couple of years, because I wasn't interested in history or travel or anything like that. I was young and full of entertaining ideas. I want to know if it's changed a bit. Somewhere around here, I think it's just off the Market Square, there's a very large car park.
Petworth is in the central western part of the county of West Sussex. It's about 15 miles north of the Roman city of Chichester, and apart from the stately home, it's known for its abundance of antique shops.
Ah, I see it's pay and display now. I'm sure it was free when I was last here. Mind you, I didn't have a car then, just a unicycle.
And I'm not making that up. Still, it's only £1.
Right, well I don't want to explore the town straight away because people, and by people I mean tourists, when they come they're more interested in the house. So let's start with that then, shall we?
Finding your way into Petworth House is not as easy as you might think. They no longer use the old main entrance, and like me, you can end up walking for miles if you're not careful.
Well, you know you're getting close because of this. This is the perimeter wall. It circumnavigates Petworth House. And the trouble is, there's lots of it. It's everywhere. Oi, let me in. Come on, let me in.
Everywhere you go, the wall looms up large, keeping us riffraff out and reminding the town just who is in charge.
So, just who is in charge? I'm not sure this is the right entrance. What can you do? Well, unfortunately, today, in this programme, we haven't got time to go inside the wonderful Petworth House and see all those magnificent paintings by Turner and Van Dyck. But I wanted to bring you out here so you could see the scale of the property and see why the house put Petworth on the map.
The house we see today is the late 17th century mansion built by Charles Seymour, the 6th Duke of Somerset. The most notable occupant, however, was the 3rd Earl of
Although the National Trust look after the property now, it is actually owned by the Wyndham family, who've been living here for the last 250 years. And they're still here today. Maybe I should go in for a cup of tea.
Many titled gentlemen have been here over the years, and it does get confusing as to who is who. And to be honest, you wouldn't remember, even if I told you.
Oh, go on then. You've got the Earls of Egremont, the Barons of Leconfield, the Earls of Northumberland, various Lords of Petworth, all twiddling their thumbs right here, going back as far as the Norman Conquest in 1066.
Petworth actually dates back to the Saxon times, when it was known as Petworth, if I've got that right, and during Edward I's reign it was known as Petworth. After the Norman Conquest, Petworth was part of the manor held for the king by Roger de Montgomery, the Earl of Arundel and Shrewsbury, but later came into the hands of the de Percy family, who held it for many generations. As a consequence, a community of townsfolk grew up alongside the original Manor House to serve and supply their master, which explains why the town juts up right against it.
Of course, about 300 years ago, this was landscaped and it looks wonderful. But go back to the medieval period, here was a tremendous forest, just perfect for a lord to go hunting. I'm not sure I should have come out this way either. Anyway, one thing's for sure, Petworth wouldn't have been here if it wasn't for the original manor. In fact, some people think that there was a castle here because it was given a licence to crenellate in 1309. Although, if there was a castle, all sign of that has disappeared. A bit like the town. I wonder where that's gone. Wow.
One of the permanent charms of the town is, of course, its market square. I mean, look at it, it's lovely. The square has that stuck-in-time feel about it.
It's been the scene of amusement and merriment over the years, and in fact, I've contributed to that entertainment several times when I lived here. I was only 18 then, but I was often performing street theatre, mime acts, juggling feats with other members of the local youth theatre. Well, it's a shame about the old scaffolding, but the grand old town hall was built by the benevolent Earl of Egremont in 1793. If you look on the rooftop, you'll see an unusual feature. There's a set of 3 bells. Do you know what they're for? I'll tell you in a minute.
The 3rd Earl of Egremont seems to have been very popular and generous with grants of money for notable buildings, as well as looking after his staff in times of hardship. Before this, I gather there was a timber-framed building, smaller and open at the bottom for the market sellers to hawk their wares and huddle under in bad weather. Upstairs would have been the serious business, where the town councillors' offices and chambers were located.
Just the sort of place to go and pay your poll tax. So what about those bells then, eh? Well, it was the town's fire alarm. You see, up there's a wire attached to the bells, comes all the way down on the front of the building into this box here, inside which is a lever. And if you grab the lever and pump it, you ring the bells, calling out the fire brigade. Such as it was. Fire! 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 Now, somewhere round here, there was a post that was used for bull baiting.
This was a barbaric sport. Bulls were tied to a stake by a rope, giving them an orbit of some 30 feet, and then wagers were taken. Dogs in turn would be sent in to immobilise the beast by biting its nose, the most sensitive part, and by doing so they would pin the massive bull right to the ground.
It sounds incredible, but quite true.
The bull, of course, would try to kick, trample or throw its opponent off, often spinning them into the air, killing or wounding the dogs in the process.
Go on, bite it, my son, bite it! It was great amusement for everyone, even the ladies apparently. And it's from this sport we get the bulldog breed. Go on, harder! It's hard to believe that people actually enjoyed that sort of thing, men and women alike, but sadly they did. And it wasn't until 1835 that this dreadful business was abolished, thanks to the Cruelty to Animals Act.
When I lived in Petworth, back at the beginning of the 1980s, I lodged in a house down this lovely cobbled street. It certainly must be one of the most picturesque in all of Sussex.
Of course, back in its day, this would have been a thriving route from the Market Square up to St Mary's there. And the whole host of businesses would have been trading all along here. See these old tiles here? They sort of indicate that perhaps there was once a butcher's shop here.
Well, according to my historic directory for 1899, it was run by Matthew William Boer.
Oh.
In 1858, William Boxall and Augustus Charles Shout ran a business as surgeons, chemists and apothecaries.
Fabulous names.
Sadly though, shortly afterwards they stopped trading. No reason is given. Perhaps they had an argument and wanted to go their separate ways. We may never know.
Well, maybe not. But I do know that there was a bootmaker, a bricklayer, and in 1899, William Knight was Petworth's town crier, living very proudly, I imagine, in Lombard Street. Oh yay, oh yay, hear me, hear me. The bold explorer is in town. I'm sure he didn't really say that, but that wasn't all he did. No, he was a confectioner and a baker, and then next door to him there was a seed dealer and a fruiterer. Golly, you needed a lot of trades back in those days to make ends meet.
Nowadays, you'd need a substantial income to be able to afford to reside in somewhere so lovely. Like so many of these types of old businesses, they've long gone, and what thrives in Petworth are its antiques. The town has become something of a mecca for the professional collector and amateur browser. What's in there? A bread oven.
Some say it's lovely, but others complain of its ugliness. But whatever your opinion, it does have a curious history. This is the parish church of St Mary the Virgin.
It is thought that there was a church here of some description going back to Saxon times, but later the tower was completed with a grand steeple made from lead and visible for miles.
Yes, but unfortunately, it was weak and it leaned at a jaunty angle. So much so that the surrounding villages taunted proud Petworth, poor people, high church, crooked steeple.
It was taken down in 1800 and another put up a few years later, but then that was removed just after the Second World War. But it is the Second World War that leads us to another piece of consecrated ground and a story far more tragic, which had all of Petworth shrouded in sadness for a very long time. On the 29th of September 1942, a lone German bomber approaching from the south aimed 3 bombs at Petworth House. All of them missed, but one struck a tree and ricocheted into the boys' school that stood just up the road, somewhere near here.
Well, I do want to find the school, but first I'd like to pay my respects.
Apparently, there was no air raid warning, and it came totally out of the blue. There were 80 children at school that day, and although many were injured, most survived. But 28 didn't.
Grim, isn't it? It is sad to imagine that down here, one after another, in a long line, are their little coffins.
They were either killed outright or crushed by falling masonry or expired from their injuries shortly afterwards. It must have been absolutely devastating for the parents. The headmaster, Charles Stevenson, and also the assistant teacher, Charlotte Marshall, perished on that day. One eyewitness reported that the bomber was diving, which would suggest a deliberate intention to hit a target, which most likely would have been Petworth House.
Well, fortunately, the boys have never been forgotten. And I actually find it quite apt that the Petworth Scouts come and maintain their grave quite regularly. But sadly, there's a bit of contention about whose responsibility it is. You see, the council say they don't own it, and the estates say it's got nothing to do with them. So unfortunately, the cemetery is left to go to rack and ruin. Now, somewhere around here, here it is. Just look at this chapel. It's falling to bits and a danger to anyone who's passing. Such a shame.
I did discover that in 1899 a John Vincent was the sexton here when it was in the hands of St Mary's. I wonder if it still is. It is a very typical Victorian cemetery though, with its long-forgotten gravestones sticking up like a series of teeth in all manner of conditions, just waiting for a dentist to look after them.
I wonder who they all were. What about this chap? Well, it says his name is John Buck. Died in September 1860 at 47 years. Also his wife Anne.
According to the historic directories, our John Buck was a cooper. That's a barrel maker, most likely for a local brewery, and he was doing that for about 20 years. He lived in North Street and was born in Rudgwick, about 12 miles to the north.
All that from an old gravestone in an abandoned cemetery. Not bad, eh?
So what about the school that was bombed? Is there anything left? Was it rebuilt? That's what I want to find out next.
Right, well, according to the old maps, the boys' school should be up here, which is just a stone's throw from the cemetery. Ah, wait a minute. Hang on a second. I think it must be about here. There's a bit of a gap here, and according to the old maps, this was the position, and you can exactly see why. There's nothing here now. There's a house that was too far back, and it's too modern. Just a minute. Yes, it's the memorial stone. See, the school was built in 1816 by the Earl of Egremont. There he is again. Originally it was designed for 30 boys, but later on it was extended and enlarged and a recreational ground put at the back. And I believe that a girls' school was constructed at about the same time, but unfortunately that too has long since disappeared. It's interesting that the memorial stone is made of marble, because I just happen to know that underneath here and all round Petworth was a large seam of this rock. And as if on cue, here's a pub with an appropriate name. Lovely, isn't it? It is a bit deceptive though, because although it looks like one large coaching inn, and of course travellers coming from Chichester to London may have popped in for a swift half, but in fact, originally it was in fact a row of 17th century cottages. Well, let's go in and have a pint, eh? You never know. It might be one that our man John Buck made the barrel for. The pub's had many different names over the years, but the Mason's Arms was prominent during the Victorian period. Well, it's now a Grade 2 listed building, but as you walk from room to room, you realise you're actually going from house to house. And interestingly, it's got the names above the doors of the previous owners. Well, thanks to the historic directories, we do have some of the names of the previous landlords. So, for example, listed in 1839, we've got one William Edwards. 22 years later, we've got listed one Robert Burdock, 69, from Dunsfold in Surrey, along with two unmarried daughters, both in their late 30s, one listed as a barmaid. Unmarried, both of them. Just saying. Lovely, isn't it? I love the countryside, and it was from the countryside that most people in Britain made their living.
The rural labourers had it tough, especially after the Enclosures Act was enforced in the 18th century, removing the rights of access to the common land and forcing them to depend on the low wages dictated by rich landowners. Survival at times was near impossible.
Before the beginning of the 19th century, if you couldn't feed yourself and your family, you could at least turn to the church for help. The Poor Law prevented you from actual starvation.
But due to stagnant wages, rising prices and an ever-increasing population, this tough life was getting worse. Newfangled agricultural improvements, such as the hated steam-powered threshing machines, were coming online, making work very scarce for the rural labourer, especially in places like Petworth. There was very little else for the uneducated and unskilled folk to do other than work on the land. The government wasn't listening and really had no comprehension of the difficulties the poor had to cope with on a daily basis. The labouring class relied heavily on the handouts from the church.
So, chuck in a couple of poor harvests and a change in the Poor Law, and life got decidedly harder than ever, especially for those families with several children. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 suddenly stopped handing out relief to those families who couldn't afford to feed themselves. Never mind paying the rent or buying such luxury goods as a candle or even a bar of soap.
Instead, a series of workhouses were erected for those in dire conditions. This is the Petworth one. They were designed to be very much the place of last resort. The government didn't want the idle poor languishing in luxury at the expense of the taxpayers, so they made conditions inside these poor houses as basic as possible.
The stigma with having to live in the workhouse was so great that many preferred to starve than to take that option. However, there was another option for those that couldn't feed themselves in Sussex. They could always go to Canada. This was the home of the Reverend Thomas Socket, who back in the 1800s, under the auspices of the Earl of Egremont, was responsible for sending 1,800 of Petworth and the surrounding areas poor across the Atlantic, up the St. Lawrence River and on to Canada.
The Petworth Immigration Committee, set up by Thomas Socket, paid the passage and provided food and necessary supplies for the trip. Socket ensured that the best would be done for those families who wanted a chance of a fresh start. He packed them on board specially commissioned ships at Portsmouth and sent them to Upper Canada, where land was plenty and work was in abundance. Letters home demonstrated the success of the scheme, encouraging others to follow.
Throughout history, if I stole an apple from a greengrocer's or a loaf of bread from a baker or even a slice of pork from a butcher, I would expect to be put in jail, sentenced and then punished for my misdemeanour.
Likewise, if I was caught poaching from the lord of the manor's forests or made off with a farmer's sheep or another man's pig, I'd be up before the beak and banged up in no time. If I owed money and couldn't pay a debt, up until the mid-19th century, I would equally be holed up and confined until such a time as I could pay it.
But parishes even had the power to round up the idle, the unkempt vagabonds, beggars, the itinerant poor who had no homes or places to call their own, and detain them in something called the House of Correction.
They were also known as bridewells, after the first of its kind in London. It was a grim institution that was designed to instill a work ethic, to correct you from your lazy ways and prepare you for industry in your community. They were worse than the workhouse, and in reality not much different from prison. And Petworth boasted a grand one. When John Howard, the infamous prison reformer, was touring the country towards the end of the 18th century, inspecting prisons, he damned Petworth's bridewell, observing that it only had 2 rooms, no window, no water and no chimney.
It stank. It was full of disease and, of course, many deaths.
There had been no attempt at separation, so women and young children mixed with the hardened felons of all ages. But after much campaigning, John Howard's reforms were being listened to, and the Earl of Egremont leased some land on the top of this hill for a new house of correction to be built.
But there doesn't seem to be much of it left today. But you can still see this tall perimeter wall. And I'm told that somewhere here you can find the date scrawls and names of some of those unfortunate enough to have spent time inside. Ah, here we are, look. There's one here.
This is the new police station in Petworth, which I'm told cost a fortune and is rarely opened. But there, behind, beautifully restored, is one of the 2 original buildings that stood in front of the House of Correction. And in one of these, the prison keeper and his wife would have lived. The House of Correction proved very successful. It was enlarged with an added women's block and more cells for the men. It dropped the correction part and was purely a prison, its primary function. It followed the new order of things, separating the prisoners not only in their cells, but in the chapel and during their exercise period.
And that wasn't the worst bit. As part of their stay, the inmates were subject to long shifts of hard labour.
For durations of up to 9 or 10 hours a day, inmates were expected to work the evil treadmill. It served purely to keep them occupied during their imprisonment.
Well, all this is obviously new and wouldn't have been here, of course, but somewhere here in this area was where the hand crank and the treadmill would have been positioned.
The hand crank was another utterly pointless exercise that both sexes were subject to, but the treadmill was the punishment that most feared and had its inherent dangers.
It was a mean machine. Many of the inmates on it would have died of exhaustion, and if they stumbled, as they often did, they would have got mangled up with the mechanics. Pretty grim.
Fortunately, the prison has long since gone, but incredibly, many of the locals I spoke to while making this film had no idea that such an establishment had ever been in their town, which just goes to show the importance of sharing a town's history. A little to the south of Petworth, on the old Chichester road, is another investment that the Earl of Egremont bestowed on the beloved people of his town. And that's what I want to explore next, the Coltishore beam pump.
Well, I must have come on the wrong day because we can't seem to get in, but inside this shed is the old beam pump that would pump the water a mile uphill in lead pipes to Petworth. A bit like this.
It pumped the water from the Rover Rother, which later the Earl had an even bigger plan for. But the area today is pretty much overgrown and almost forgotten.
This was the site of several corn mills in the 13th century, but unfortunately the last one burnt down in 1923, and all we've got left is this engine house and a few bits and pieces, sluice pipes and what have you.
We think of hydropower as being a modern invention, but mills, such as this one at Coltishore, were using water to grind their corn as far back as the Roman times. If we're not careful, we could lose our heritage if we don't keep a record of these important and once bustling places. It's all too easy to drive past and miss the relics of our industrial history. I like nothing better to stop and have a poke about and see what I can discover.
Wow, now this is really exciting. I didn't know this was here. This is an old navigation lock. Wow, it's still in reasonable nick after all this time. The Earl of Egremont was really interested in investing in the local community, especially for the farmers, and this navigation became an absolute essential for getting goods up and down from London and to the coast.
Transporting your wares by horse and cart on roads back in those days was hard work. Far easier to stick them on a barge and go by water.
You can just make out where the old lock gates would have been. There's these indentations in the walls here, and I can easily picture in my mind the big wooden doors with the beam that would have opened and shut them spewing out behind me, and then away the barges would have gone. Amazing.
With a little imagination, we can visualise just how busy the place must have been and why the Earl was so keen to invest in its future. But unfortunately, the future was doomed. Canals were outmoded almost as soon as they came online, for the iron horse on rails came thundering along, ensuring their demise. But it is wonderful to cast one's mind back to that slower way of life.
It's a very short stroll from the old lock and beam pump to here, Rother Bridge. Of course, this wasn't the original bridge. There used to be an old stone bridge crossing the Rover Rother many, many moons ago. And this is the old Chichester to Petworth route. It's just a dirt track these days. They've built a new road a little further to the east. It's a nice walk though. Hard to believe that this old track was the main route down to the coast. And of course it was used by the smugglers, great gangs, 60 of them all at once, hiding their contraband along the route. Haven't seen any smugglers yet.
Just one more stop before I'm done. I mentioned the coming of the railways just now. Well, Petworth had its own station a little to the south of the town, and that too almost disappeared thanks to Mr. Beeching. But these days it's a very pleasant bed and breakfast establishment.
Wow. This is very authentic. Here we are. Look, booking office.
Good afternoon, sir.
Hello. Could I have a first-class ticket to Midhurst, please?
First class to Midhurst.
Yes. Wow. Well, you certainly don't see so many railway stations in this day and age so elegantly presented. It's beautiful. You know, there's really no question, you really get transported back to the spirit of the late 1900s. It's hard to believe, really, that it's no longer in service anymore, because I could quite happily picture myself waiting here for the 9:32 to Midhurst. Well, I have to say, I've never seen a Pullman carriage close up before, and I'm really excited, and I'm very impressed with the state of the preservation. But what about the insides? Now this is the moment I've been waiting for. Come on, let's take a peek. Tickets, please. Tickets, please. This is absolutely gorgeous. Wow. Pullman. Wow. It's absolutely most desirable. You know, I wish I was staying here the night. Well, I've really enjoyed my visit to Petworth, so why not join me again the next time when I go exploring. Until then, goodbye.